Tell me, first of all, your reaction to the Supreme Court in America and their changing the law, striking out Roe versus Wade. So it's up to the states now, rather than the federal government and rather than the courts. There's no constitutional right to an abortion in America. This is something that our previous guest thought was a good thing, thought was progress, and thought that they called Roe versus Wade a trick. I wonder what you think of that.
I completely disagree. I am really disappointed with the decision by the US Supreme Court. I think that a woman should always have the right to choose, which is what the law is in the UK. And I guess the reason we're talking about this so much, not just because it's a global issue, but because there are fears, I think, within the UK and maybe within European nations as well, where there is a bit of a mix when it comes to abortion, for example, Poland. So that there are fears that maybe we are heading that way as well. Abortion is a controversial issue, but for me, I think it's absolutely in the women's right to choose. We should and have control over our bodies. And I truly believe that if anybody believes in freedom, free speech, those sorts of things, then we should really be also allowing women to have control over their bodies. I disagree about the states, actually, because now what you can see, and in some horrendous things that some of the states have come up with, women are not allowed to have abortion in some states in the US, even in cases of rape or incest. That can't be right.
My view is largely your view, but it's slightly different. Let me tell you what it is, and let me know what you think. So, I don't want abortion to ever happen. I think abortion is dreadful. I think it's in an ideal world, abortion should never happen. But I accept 100% that it will happen, that there will be unplanned pregnancies, there will be all sorts of people in all sorts of situations who will want to have an abortion. And it's not my right to tell them whether they should have or should not have an abortion. And what I think, and what the evidence proves, is that abortions will happen, whether they are backstreet abortions, whether there are people doing dangerous things to get rid of a fetus. That is what will happen. So it's going to happen. So let's do it medically, let's do it safely, let's keep women alive, and let's make sure that it's done in as safe a way as it possibly can be. That's my view, which is slightly different to your view, but nonetheless, I think it's appalling what has happened in America.
Yeah, I think I certainly agree with the second part of what you said there. So that point around the fact that abortions happen anyway. We have seen, and there are lots of really important films in the UK that talk about what it was like here for women before abortions were allowed to happen medically and in safe places. Abortions happen anyway. Unplanned pregnancies happen anyway. And basically, if we do not allow access to safe abortion for women, it means that you have backstreet abortions, as you've said, and that causes pain, trauma, and sometimes death. So that cannot be right. In a civilized society, we need to allow women the same freedoms that men have, and men have freedom over their bodies, and women should have the same.
Okay. Let's talk about politics, because that's the reason we got you on as the Vice President of the Liberal Democrats. You must be absolutely delighted at the result in Tiverton and Honiton. Well done to the Liberal Democrats for that. Why do you think that happened? Why do you think it was such a historic change in terms of the voters of Tiverton and Honiton, who the constituency was created in 1997, which was a Conservative victory even in 1997 when there were so few Conservative victories, of course, and they haven't had any representative who's not a Conservative in Parliament, no matter what constituency they're part of, since 1920. So why did they turn yellow, do you think?
I think it's the national picture as well as local problems. So the national picture is one where the Prime Minister is currently seen as someone who is, by some in the country, as someone who perhaps doesn't see it their way, doesn't suffer in the same way they do.
Probably you as well.
Prices. Sorry?
You probably think that as well, I would imagine.
Yeah, I do. Some people, including myself. So I think there's a sense that this government doesn't get it. There's a sense that this Prime Minister is the leader of that government, and he, especially with what's happened with Partygate, even though we're not talking about that quite as much, there's a sense that he's not quite our man anymore. And I think that really played out in Tiverton and Honiton. It wasn't the first thing people were talking about, though. What people were talking about was the local schools, which are in dire need of repair. Children are sitting in classrooms with water dripping on them from the ceiling. That's not an acceptable situation in our country. The second thing people I've been told we're really talking about were NHS services, and particularly dentistry. It's always been difficult to get access to a dentist. I find that myself. But actually, it's something that in that area, in Tiverton-Honiton constituency, has been really, really tough. And thirdly, Partygate. So those were the three areas that people were, not of everyone, obviously, but there was definitely a sense that people were changing their minds. And we've seen that because the majority now, it wasn't as close as people might have thought. There was a sense beforehand, certainly from the bookies, that actually it was going to be such a close race. And I think even internally, we thought that too, because it was a big majority to overturn, but we threw everything at it. And we see the result of that in the 6,000 majority, which is really a fantastic result.
It's interesting because the Liberal Democrats now have 14 MPs. They are the third largest party in England. Do you think this is a one-off? Or, by-elections are only ever a snapshot? Or do you think that the Liberal Democrats have been forgiven for what many people saw as a betrayal over tuition fees, or more broadly, going in with the Conservatives as part of the coalition between 2010 and 2015?
Well, this might feel like a one-off, but those of us who are a bit more invested in politics and spend far too much of our lives in it will remember the three by-elections victories for the Liberal Democrats in the last year only, but slightly over a year actually. Chesham and Amersham, Tiverton-Honiton, and obviously North Shropshire as well. So areas that were true blue beforehand and have really changed their minds and have gone for an alternative vote. So this shows us a trend rather than a snapshot. By-elections do show us how people are feeling at the moment, and certainly the cost of living crisis, it's so expensive to fill up your car, it is so difficult to get a dentist appointment, it can be really feel very hard when things are not, when your pay is not covering your rent and the things that you have to pay for your family every month. That's what's really at the heart of this. Now, I will, even as Liberal Democrat, I will admit that this government is not totally, it is not the fault of this government that there is high inflation. Yeah. High inflation is a global issue. It's related to the war in Ukraine. It's all sorts of things.
Okay.
But the reality is that there is more that this government could do, and they're not doing it. So that's what we need to, as an opposition, and voters are telling us that over and over again in by-elections.
Okay. Amna Ahmed, thank you very much indeed, Vice President of the Liberal Democrats. Isn't it refreshing